Hi, I'm Dr. Musil, and welcome to Lecture 4, Social Contract Theory, where we talk about social contract theory by discussing John Locke's philosophy or moral philosophy, social and political philosophy in general, really. We've already been introduced to John Locke, talked about him, indirectly in our previous lecture when we talked about Thomas Hobbes. As I emphasized in that lecture, Hobbes and Locke have a lot in common. They are both social contract theorists, right? They endorse this idea that what legitimizes a government, right, is the consent of the people that are governed, their agreement to be governed in the first place. Of course, there's a lot more to it, and as we've already discussed, Hobbes and Locke, while they offer a lot of similarities across the board, they do offer important differences, and we've already discussed a few of those, but those become even more appreciable in this lecture. We'll highlight those even more. So let's begin by introducing John Locke himself, talking a little bit more about him. Again, we did get to meet him, so to speak, in the previous lecture, but who is this John Locke figure? I mentioned in the previous lecture that there's a good reason why so many Americans tend to be more familiar with John Locke as opposed to Thomas Hobbes. And that's interesting given, as I've said, right, that they share so many similarities in their philosophy. So what is it about Locke that so many why is it that so many Americans are more familiar with Locke as opposed to Hobbes? And the answer is related to a similar question, and that is why were the founding fathers such fans of Locke and not necessarily Hobbes? And I gave the answer away, I think, in the previous lecture. I alluded to it, but as we'll see, basically, the answer is Locke's going to justify revolution, breaking away from a contract, whereas Hobbes, and again, I tried to really hammer this point home in the previous lecture, right? Hobbes seems to suggest that any social contract is preferable to a state of nature. So we're best off holding on to any contract, as dire as it might seem, right? As tyrannical as the government might seem, that's better off than reverting back to the state of nature. Okay, and Locke's not like that, right? He's going to justify breaking away from a government. So, right? Naturally, the founding fathers, who were involved in a revolution, are going to latch onto Locke as opposed to Hobbes, given that. And it's interesting. You get a lot of Locke's philosophy shining right through in the founding documents of our country, in the Constitution, Declaration of Independence, almost verbatim, at times, the way things are stated, it's taken from Locke's philosophy. So there's no denying that John Locke had a huge influence on the founding fathers of our country, or of the United States, I should say. So he influenced the founding fathers. Okay. Some peripheral points, not necessarily that important to moral philosophy, but interesting nonetheless. John Locke, he is an example of a philosopher who dabbled in a lot of different things. So he's really well known, obviously, for the kind of things we're going to talk about today, but he also made huge contributions in other aspects of philosophy. For example, epistemology. Remember, epistemology is the category of philosophy concerned with questions regarding knowledge. And John Locke is a famous empiricist. So you might have heard of, empiricism. So there's a famous debate. It's still, alive to this day between empiricism and rationalism that really came to the forefront in the modern era of philosophy during John Locke's time. So he's one of the primary or most well-known empiricists, defenders of empiricism, whereas like Immanuel Kant would be an example of a rationalist, or René Descartes. So what is this debate about? Very briefly, again, this isn't related to moral philosophy per se, but basically the debate's about how we acquire knowledge. So, disregard what it is we claim to know at the moment, right? The issue, rationalism versus empiricism. The issue is, how do we acquire that knowledge? How is it that we come to acquire the knowledge that we have? And the empiricist says, basically, all knowledge, right, whatever it is we claim to know, required experience. It's not possible to know anything without experience. And so that was John Locke's position. He famously posited that we're born with a tabula rasa, right, which is the Latin phrase for blank slate, right? And then the idea is everything then is subsequently imparted upon us, whatever it is we come to know, then is subsequently imparted upon us by way of our experience. So Locke was of the opinion, right? Here's an empiricist. He's of the opinion that we can't come to know anything without experience. Whereas the rationalists, they would suggest that there are certain kinds of knowledge, for example, mathematical knowledge, say 2 + 2 = 4. The idea is we don't need the aid of experience to come to know those things. It's almost like we come pre-programmed maybe to know that, right? We don't need the aid of experience or require any experience to figure that out. And of course, the empiricists are just going to deny that, right? They're going to say, no, you had no concept of 2 and then plus any of that without learning via experience from teachers and parents and so on. So again, not something that we need to worry too much about, but John Locke was very much involved in that epistemological debate between the rationalists or rationalism and the empiricists or empiricism. And again, he was one of the MVPs, if you will, of empiricism. Blah, blah, blah. So that was slide or page 2. We'll turn then to slide 3. I already kind of alluded to this, right? Huge, influencer in terms of the founding fathers, including the 3 main aspects of a sound government that he appeals to, right? That he writes about, right? He mentions we need sound laws, we need impartial judges, and we need adequate means. This was a big issue as he'll say, in the state of nature. We need adequate means to enforce the natural law, right? That's one thing that we're really lacking is we have no means. If somebody violates the natural law, we have no means to do anything about it in the state of nature. Okay, so we need sound laws, impartial judges, and a way to execute the natural law, right? To enforce it. Right? And again, that's basically the gist of it's going to be, he's not nearly as pessimistic about the state of nature as Hobbes is, and we alluded to that last lecture. But still, we can improve, right? While we're in the state of nature, those 3 things are kind of lacking, as we'll find out here as we move on, right? We don't really have adequate interpretation of the natural law, right? So we need better legislation, as he would say, or sounder laws, more explicit laws, and that's what we're going to get then from a government that's instituted, right? We need impartial judges. Typically, like if we were back in the state of nature, right, we tend to be more just than Hobbes would suggest we are, right? But Locke's still going to concede that when we're involved in disputes and so on, we're human, right? And we have vested interests and so on. So we're going to be a little biased. And so even though things aren't as dreary as Hobbes suggests, right, we still lack a degree of partiality that we can gain by getting into a society, right, where we can then get impartial judges to rule over cases where we would otherwise be involved. Hopefully that makes sense, right? So sound laws, right, we lack those in the state of nature, and that's one of the things we're going to get, right? Impartial judges, we lack those in the state of nature, and that's one of the things we're going to get by getting into a social contract and instituting a government and so on. All right, and then we need an enforcing body, an executive branch, right, to then enforce that social contract or whatever agreements we've made, and whatever the impartial judges decide, right, to enforce the penalties and so on. So he appeals to these 3 main aspects of a sound government, and lo and behold, what do you see shine through in the founding fathers and what they suggest about a sound government? Those 3 very things are exactly what they home in on, right? And they correlate then to our 3 branches of our government, right? The legislative, judicial, and executive branches as outlined in the Constitution. Okay, so again, that's Locke, an example of Locke and his influence shining through in the founding fathers and obviously the U.S. Constitution. Okay, so going on to slide 4, we want to talk a little. So we've introduced John Locke. Hopefully we have a pretty decent idea. Again, he's to give you an idea, Hobbes was the early 1600s, and Locke is more towards the end of the 1600s. And I think he died, I want to say 1711 or something, somewhere around there. So he's later than Hobbes, okay? But again, an English philosopher, very, very famous and well known in many, many aspects of philosophy. So moving on, though, let's talk then about the state of nature, I briefly mentioned kind of how it's obviously a little bit more his picture of the state of nature is a little bit more optimistic than Hobbes, right? But what exactly does it look like? Well, like Hobbes, right? There's going to be some similarities here. Locke's going to suggest we're basically free and equal. Okay, so as he says he appeals to that on page 195. He talks about how there's basically this state of equality in the state of nature, and he also says, this is from page 195 of our textbook, it's, quote, a state of perfect freedom. Okay, and this is where it gets interesting, though. It's a state of perfect freedom, but, right, this freedom lies within the bounds of what he calls the law of nature, or another way of putting that is natural law. So we're free, but that's free within the bounds of the natural law. And this is where he's different from Hobbes, right? For Hobbes, no, we're truly free. We're free in an absolute sense. We have a right to everything. There's no qualifications here on Hobbes's part. No, we are completely free. Whereas Locke says we're free. This is a state of perfect freedom, but hold up, right? That's within the bounds of the natural law. Okay, and so this is a key big difference, and this intimates or suggests, right, one of the main differences between the two, and that's that, as we alluded to the last lecture, Hobbes does not believe in a natural sense of justice. Back in the state of nature, there's no such thing as right and wrong for Hobbes, right? It's only after we institute the social contract that we have an idea of right and wrong. Right meaning abiding by the contract, wrong meaning not abiding by the contract. Whereas Locke wants to say, no, in the state of nature, okay, we do have a sense of justice. Okay, and we're going to elaborate on that in the next slide here, right? And that's the sense in which, because we have access to that natural sense of justice, right? Although we're free, right? It's a state of perfect freedom, as he says. We're still bound or obligated in some sense to adhere to the law of nature, the natural law, which we ascertain through our rational capacity. So here we have, again, by the way, a philosopher stressing the importance or significance of reason, right? So for Locke, okay, this would be, in some sense, a state of absolute freedom in the typical way we would interpret saying absolutely free, right? But we have this thing called reason, which allows us to reflect on our situation and realize, hey, everyone else is kind of similar to me. Don't I owe them a degree of respect, right? And so this reason then is going to help us, right, appreciate what he calls the natural law and realize that although we could go up and just take whatever we wanted from someone else, right, or murder, rape, enslave them, right, we shouldn't, okay? And again, it's our rational capacity that allows us to appreciate this. So this is why he says things then like, again on page 195, quote, though this be a state of liberty, yet it is not a state of license, okay? You have the freedom, but, you shouldn't just do whatever the heck you want, okay? And he would say most of us in such a state wouldn't. Whereas, of course, Hobbes is going to say, oh, yeah, we are. We're going to do whatever we can, whenever we can, if we can get away with it, Hobbes would say, right? But Locke's going to say, no, most of us, thanks in large part to this rational capacity, we have an appreciation, a respect for others, right? We want others to succeed. We want to cooperate. We sympathize with others. And now we are human, and we do get our feelings hurt, and we do have biases and so on. And so, again, that's going to suggest why Locke still thinks we have something to gain by getting out of the state of nature, even though it's not as bad as Hobbes suggests. So moving on to slide 5, okay, let's talk a little bit more about this idea of the natural law. So we're all equal. Again, this is all solicited from our rational capacity, our ability to reason, right? We sense that, hey, we're all kind of in this together. We're all relatively equal. Okay? And from this sense of equality, again, it's our reason that's telling us, Locke thinks, that we owe each other, right, some semblance of respect, right? So he says things like this then again on 195, quote, the state of nature has a law of nature to govern it, which obliges everyone, and reason, which is that law, teaches all mankind who will but consult it, that being all equal and independent, no one ought to harm another in his life, health, liberty, or possessions, end quote. And then similarly, again on 195, going on to 196, he says, quote, when his own preservation comes not in competition, ought he, as much as he can, to preserve the rest of mankind. And again, it's our reason, our reflective capacity that allows us to sort of figure that out, Locke says. Of course, Hobbes is just going to flat out deny all that. He also is a big believer in reason, but of course for him it's an egoistic tool to further our own interests and our chances of survival and flourishing. Whereas for Locke, it seems to have an endearing effect where not only does it tell us, like Hobbes says, how to further our own interests and survive and flourish, but it also is the reason why we have some appreciation for everyone else, right? Who's engaged in the same everyday struggle to survive, right? And it's the source then, according to Locke, for sympathy and respect and this desire to cooperate with others. So again, big difference, right? This suggests, right, Locke is a believer in a natural sense of justice, thanks to our rational capacity. We're not going to just go and it's not going to be as dreary if we're in the state of nature as Hobbes suggests, right? We're not going to go and pillage one another and try to hoard goods and steal from each other and so on and so forth, because this rational capacity, which is common to and guides us all, allows us to appreciate that we're all going through the same thing, more or less. And so, turning our attention to slide 6, we have this ability, right, to access and appreciate this so-called natural law, according to Locke. And then, so too, we have we ought to feel the license, right, or have the license to then punish those who do not comply with this natural law, right? Human beings who have a rational capacity and yet refuse to offer the respect due to others, right? So he says, look, if this natural sense of justice is violated, if this natural law is violated, there's two justifications for then harming someone, right? We have the idea of restraint, right? Restraining them, not allowing them to continue to do what they're doing, right? That's harmful. And then also maybe, punishing them for the sake of deterrence, right? So that they won't continue to do it. And then also we have you can punish or harm them for the sake of reparations, right? Getting something back. If they stole something from you, right, we might take 10 of their bananas, right, as a form of reparation and making things equal again, so to speak. Okay? And he thinks, look, wherever we find ourselves, whether it's within a society, under a government, in which case the government will do this sort of thing for us, right? Or if we're back in the state of nature, we have license, okay, to interpret and enforce the natural law. Okay? And if we're back in the state of nature, then we can take it upon ourselves when people are violating the natural law to do something about it. And for those two chief reasons, typically, restraint and reparation. Okay? So ultimately, as he says in the state of nature and in commonwealths, quote, each transgression or violation, right, of the natural law may be punished to that degree and with so much severity as will suffice to make it an ill bargain to the offender, give him cause to repent, and terrify others from doing the like. And that's actually not included in the text that we have, but it's from right around there in the original document. Okay, so I've already intimated, why it is. So if it's not as pessimistic and dreary as Hobbes says, why do we need to get out of the state of nature? Because we're still human, right? We still will make mistakes. Locke's going to suggest, right? We'll still have biases. Especially when we're involved in transgressions, right? If somebody's violated us, we're going to be especially upset in those instances. Or if, one of our close relatives is violated, we're going to be upset. And, Locke's going to suggest we're better off in a situation than when unbiased, judges would be involved as opposed to us, right, who are clearly biased, right? And so, again, even though we all have access in the state of nature to this natural law, we can all glean what it is and what it looks like thanks to our rational capacity. Our ability to interpret it, judge cases where there's been violations of it, and then enforce, punishments and so on when there's been violations of it. Our ability to do all those things is hampered in the state of nature. And so we still have things to get by getting out of the state of nature then. Okay? It's not as dreary and bad as Hobbes suggests. We don't have as much to gain as Hobbes suggests, Locke says, but we still have a lot to gain by forming a social contract, escaping that state of nature, getting out of it, forfeiting, just as Hobbes said, some of our freedoms and abilities we had in the state of nature, for then a greater sense of security, right? Because everyone else is doing the same thing. Again, we've formed a contract where I agree that I won't do whatever I want, and you too agree that you won't do whatever you want, right? You won't do all these certain things that are specified, and I won't do them to you either. Okay? So there is a purpose for a government. There is a reason why, again, we ought to enter into the social contract, and that's what I get at on slide 7. Okay? So he says things, and this is furthering what I was just getting at. He says things on 198 of our textbook. Quote, it will be objected that it is unreasonable for men to be judges in their own cases, that self-love will make men partial to themselves and their friends, and on the other side that ill nature, passion, and revenge will carry them too far in punishing others. Okay, again, we have our biases. We're not perfect. So governments are going to help ensure, right, forming social contracts and then having sovereigns in place or governments in place to enforce them. They're going to ensure fairer interpretation, judgment, and then enforcement of the natural law. As he says on 198, quote, civil government is the proper remedy for the inconveniences of the state of nature. What I find interesting, and I think what's really worth emphasizing here, is almost immediately after he describes the benefits of entering into a social contract, submitting to a sovereign or a government, right, and so on, he then turns his attention to warning us, right, about the possibilities of government corruption, right, the sovereign becoming corrupt. So almost immediately, right, while it's for our best interest to submit to a social contract and to a sovereign, look out, right, because, hey, the sovereign, he or she is human, or they are human as well, right? So ultimately, for the same reasons we got out of the state of nature, right, because we're biased and so on, those same problems can creep into governments themselves, right? And so he immediately starts to warn his readers, be on the lookout, right? Yes, it's good. It behooves us to enter into a social contract, but whoever's running the show, right, they're human, and so they're liable, right? They're susceptible to the same biases and same inevitable, not necessarily inevitable, the same types of corruption are possible for them as well. Okay, so, and this is what's interesting. I mentioned this before, right? That for Hobbes, it's almost as if any contract, social contract, and so too concomitant government is preferable to the state of nature. But for Locke, he actually emphasizes the opposite. It's, he says, look, we're better off back in the state of nature than we are under some tyrants, right? And that's what he gets at on page 198. He says, with respect to a corrupt monarchy, quote, much better it is in the state of nature, wherein men are not bound to submit to the unjust will of another. So is it a surprise that the founding fathers, right, bought into Locke, right, and what he's saying? I mean, when he says things like that. Okay, so we see again that he is a social contract theorist, and we've talked. Hopefully, you have a good idea of what we mean by a social contract theory, right? You come together, you submit, right? You've given your consent to be governed by the sovereign, as Hobbes would say, right? This again a fancy word for a government that's going to then, right? That government then is tasked with enforcing the social contract. I wanted to point out, though, but real quick before I forget, that Hobbes is a moral conventionalist. I should note this, right? He thinks it's something we've created, right? That it's in the sense that it's for our own interests. Whereas again, Locke, no, it's something that's there, right? It's natural law. It's natural. Even in the state of nature, right? We have a sense of morality that's there that we can access. Okay, it's through our rational capacity. So it's not something we've created, right? Rather, we access it through reason, and it's there for us to access, according to Locke. So I wanted to point out that again, when it comes to moral conventionalism, and that was the bottom point that I had down here before I raised all this. Hobbes is a moral conventionalist. It's something we create when we institute the social contract. For Locke, that's not the case. No, Locke is not a moral conventionalist. Morality is always there. That sense of justice is always there, even in the state of nature. Hence, he believes in a natural sense of justice. Locke, right? Not Hobbes. So Locke is not a moral conventionalist. It's not something we create. It's there naturally, and it's just it's up to us then through reason to properly access it, if you will. Right? So Locke is not a moral conventionalist. Well, Hobbes is, but they both are social contract theorists. Okay? They both think the legitimacy of a sovereign or a government comes from the consent of the people governed. Okay? And like Hobbes, this is again slide 9, Locke claims that men, quote, unite into a community for their comfortable, safe, and peaceable living. This is all on 200. Another quote, when any number of men have so consented to make one community or government, they are thereby presently incorporated and make one body politic, wherein the majority have a right to act and conclude the rest. And finally, also on page 200, quote, it is necessary the body should move that way whither the greater force carries it, which is the consent of the majority. Right? So we have this idea, we all come together, there's a bunch of us, these are all different people with different wants and desires and wills. Okay? And he says, look, we've submitted, right? We're not going to just do whatever we want. So we have to go then, granted, we're not always going to want the same thing. We have to go with what the majority, let's say the majority, these guys all want to go this way. These guys want to go this way. We have to go with what the majority wants, right? And he does emphasize that quite a bit. That's what I get to on slide 10. He says, look, we're submitting, right? When we enter into a social contract, we're forfeiting, as Hobbes would say, that absolute freedom or that right to everything we had. Okay, we can't just do whatever we want. Well, there's only two kinds of ways that will look then, right? If we're not doing just whatever we want, then we have to kind of move along with everyone else, right? And there's two ways that can go. Either we go with what the majority says, or we require that for us to move at all, everyone's on board, right? We only move when everyone consents to doing whatever. Well, he says, look, that's pretty much impossible. You're never going to get a unanimous decision about anything. So the only alternative left, right, for a sensible interpretation of what it's going to look like to submit to a contract, right, to agree not to do certain stuff, the only sensible way of interpreting how that will look like, what that process is going to be like, is to interpret it as being you're going to go with the majority, right, the majority rules, so to speak. Okay. So that's why he was saying the other alternative, right, where you require everyone to be on board with something before you do it. That's not practical. As he says on 200, such consent, unanimous consent, is next to impossible ever to be had. And so he says, again on 200, quote, thus every man, by consenting with others to make one body politic under one government, puts himself under an obligation to everyone of that society to submit to the determination of the majority, or else this original compact, right, the social contract, whereby he with others incorporates into one society would signify nothing. In sum, what, quote, begins and actually constitutes any political society is nothing but the consent of any number of free men capable of a majority to unite and incorporate into such a society. And that kind of gives you the essence of what social contract theory looks like. Like we come together, we all have these different wants and desires, but we come together, we agree that it's for the best not to just do whatever we want, and as Locke would insist, right, do rather what the majority deems appropriate at any given time. Okay. But moving on to slide 11, we go into a little bit more detail, specifying again why it is that Locke thinks it does behoove us to get out of the state of nature and enter into a social contract. In general, he's on board with Hobbes, right? We're basically abandoning some of our freedom that we had in the state of nature to then garner a greater sense of security, right? For Hobbes, you had no sense of security in the state of nature because nobody's trustworthy, there's no natural sense of justice, and so on. For Locke, you had some sense of justice, right? And you had some sense of security. It wasn't as dreary as what Hobbes suggested, but you still feel a lot safer and, within a social contract, Locke would say. Okay, so we are gaining a greater sense of security, Locke would suggest, by forfeiting that freedom we had in the state of nature and entering into a society, into a social contract that'll be enforced again by the sovereign or the government. Okay. Locke pointing this kind of thing out, he says on 201, quote, the enjoyment of the property he has in this state, and he's referencing the state of nature, is very unsafe, very unsecure. So what you're getting then by entering into a social contract is that safety, right? You're securing your property. Remember, for Locke, property has a very wide or general connotation, right? It encompasses everything about us, right? Our life, liberty, and all our material possessions. Okay? So all of that is unsecure in the state of nature, is what he's saying. It could be a lot more secure within a social contract. Okay? So, and again, we find, going back to those three main aspects of a sound government, we find those three things lacking in the state of nature. Okay, so by exiting out of the state of nature and getting into a social contract, we're going to improve upon these things, right? So back in the state of nature, we lacked, right, what he would say is adequate legislation, right, or adequate interpretation, definition, figuring out of that natural law, right? It's there, and we have the rational capacity to access it, but a lot of us struggle with that. And so a government, a legitimate government that's doing what it's supposed to is going to adequately legislate things. It's going to provide sound laws. That's extremely important for law. Right, so what it's going to provide, what is the social contract going to provide? Legislation, right? Proper interpretation and application of that natural law that already exists, right? So legislation with respect to, again, the natural law. What else are we gaining? Again, we're biased, okay? And so we don't want to be involved in cases that, we don't want to be judging cases that we're actually involved in, right? And so by entering into a social contract, we're going to then get better judges, namely impartial ones. We're going to get better legislation of the natural law, better judges with respect to cases where this has been violated. That won't be as harsh, right? If we were judging cases where, if we were in charge of punishing the person that stole from us, we're probably going to punish them a little bit harsher than somebody that's not involved in the case. Okay? And that's what we get by getting the social contract. We gain access to these impartial judges. And then, and I would say, although Locke really emphasizes the importance of this, okay, this one seems to me, extremely important, right? Because we completely lack this, some way of enforcing, let's say, just enforcement, adequate enforcement of, right, the natural law. So when you have instances, for example, where it's been violated, doing something about it, being able to do something about it. Okay, we're oftentimes, if we're in the state of nature, are we going to be in a position to do anything about Beavis over there who stole our bananas? Maybe not. Whereas when we're under a social contract, right, we can call the police, and then we can, take them to court, and then we have the prison system and so on to do something about it. And that's the idea here, and that's what we're getting out of entering into a social contract according to Locke. Okay, so turning to 12. Again, don't forget though that the government is just as susceptible, Locke wants to warn us, as we were in the state of nature, almost just as susceptible to the same sorts of issues, right? Biases, corruption, and so on. So we need to, one of the big points of emphasis for Locke is the need to sort of place checks and balances on the government or on the sovereign that we put into place. We need to place adequate limitations on the government, on the sovereign, which is really the opposite point of emphasis that you saw with Hobbes. Remember, for Hobbes, no, we need to endow that sovereign with absolute power. We need to make it extremely powerful, the government, so that then all of us greedy, self-interested humans that would otherwise try to get away with stuff whenever we could, we will in fact actually abide by the contract, right? So again, Hobbes immediately emphasizes the need for a very powerful sovereign or government. And here you have Locke almost immediately emphasizing the opposite. Be careful. Whatever government we institute, right, whatever that sovereign looks like, hey, that can benefit us in those ways we just enumerated, but the government or that sovereign can also screw us over. Okay? So we need to be careful. And one way to sort of capture this point, right, is this idea of consent, right, with social contract. Okay, with Hobbes, the idea is, look, you need the initial consent of the people, right? When they first come to form the social contract, they all need to be on board. But that's it. At that point, then, the sovereign needs to have the power to do whatever it wants or needs to do, okay, for the sake of being powerful and, striking fear in the people that are being governed. Otherwise, they're going to try to be the sneaky devils they are. Okay, so the sovereign only needs the initial consent of the people governed. Whereas for Locke, you have this emphasis on no. You need the initial and the continued So the idea is it's not good enough just for the people to be okay with the sovereign initially. No, they have to constantly say, yeah, I'm down with that sovereign. Yeah, that sovereign seems to be not neglecting my interests. Okay, I'm cool with them. Right? If at any point they're like, no, seems to be turning tyrannical, not cool, then they have the right, the license, and it's not even Locke speaks as if it's not only do they have the right, it's almost as if they have the obligation. They ought to, right? Then disband, right? Revolt. Say, no, we're done with you. We're done with this contract. It's not in our interest anymore. You're neglecting our interests. Okay, so it's interesting here because you have, again, completely different points of emphasis on the part of Hobbes and Locke. And so that comes out in this distinction, right? Hobbes is requiring, says the sovereign only needs, and so too the social contract, right, that the sovereign is enforcing. It only needs the initial consent of those governed. At that point, right, anything goes. The sovereign's free to do as it pleases, and you need that kind of power in the sovereign for the sake of adequately being able to enforce the contract in the first place. Otherwise, people won't fear the sovereign and they'll do whatever they want. Whereas Locke, again, no, it's not just the initial consent. You need the initial and the continued consent of the people. The sovereign needs the continued consent at all times of those governed. Without that, then revolution is justified. And again, you see then why the founding fathers were big fans of Locke. Sign me up for Locke, right, and not Hobbes. Okay. Blah, blah, blah. I mentioned, but I'll just repeat, right? He's a big fan, especially of that first thing we gained, proper interpretation and legislation of the natural law, right? Which would be like the legislative branch of the government. So he does emphasize how, that it seems to him almost the most important, right? But we also get all three of the other two things as well. But I wanted to emphasize that because that is a bullet point here on slide 12. Otherwise, we made those points. So we'll move on then to the last slide, slide 13, where we'll really hammer home the major differences. So before this, I want to preface this discussion by just reiterating that, look, these two, despite these significant differences we're about to highlight again, these two actually say many of the same things. 95%, right? At least moral and political philosophy, their moral and political philosophy very similar in the way they describe things, right? They're both social contract theorists and so on. So don't forget that. But having said that, right, they do differ in three significant ways, and especially when it comes to their moral view, right, which is why we're here. So without further ado, how do they differ, right? They differ in terms of that fundamental view of our human nature. So this goes back to that difference that we've been hammering home throughout the last lecture and this lecture, right? Locke is much more optimistic. Okay? Hobbes much more pessimistic. But I do think, and I reiterate this point on slide 13 here, go back to page 184 and 185 of the textbook, right? If you are not on board with what Hobbes says, right, what about his point that we're still, even when we're actually within a sovereign, right, or are governed by a sovereign, within a social contract, with the policing force in place, right, we still lock our doors, we still lock our chests within our own houses from our own family, says Hobbes. I don't know about you guys, but apparently they still did that in Hobbes' day at least. And I mentioned last video, I think, that at some point whenever I teach this in class, somebody's like, well, I don't lock my door. And then I say, well, what's your address? And I write it up here for everybody, right? The idea that's a pretty compelling point, on Hobbes' part. Even when we have a social contract in place, look at all these measures we take that seem to be indicative of a lack of trust of one another, right? Now imagine that in the state of nature. Right? So very big difference there. Okay? Again, Locke, much more the optimist, in part because of our rational capacity. Says we have this ability upon reflection to appreciate how similar we all are, right? And in that sense, how equal we are, at least we should be, he says. Big difference, and this is arguably the main difference for us, right? Their view of a natural sense of justice. Does morality exist in the state of nature? Hobbes? No. Remember, force and fraud, great things in the state of nature. They're only wrong once you enter into a social contract, right? At which point they're stipulated in our laws and our legislation as being wrong. Okay. But for Locke, yes, there is this natural sense of justice. Right? Those sorts of things, force and fraud, for example, murder, rape, slavery, those sorts of things, they're wrong, whether we're within a contract or not. Locke would say, because again, our reason allows us to access that natural law, which suggests, right, that we're all equal. So what are we doing, murdering each other or enslaving each other or something along those lines, right? So Locke, very much a proponent, a believer in a natural sense of justice. Okay? We don't gain morality by entering into the social contract, according to Locke. But that's exactly what happens according to Hobbes, right? We create it. It's a convention of ours, according to Hobbes, right, that we create when we enter into the social contract. So big, huge point of difference. Again, Hobbes is a moral conventionalist. Locke is not. Locke believes in a natural sense of justice. Hobbes does not. Okay? So hopefully that point's pretty clear at this point. And then the third major difference, and then we got done highlighting this with the continued, initial and continued consent point. But their view of sort of government, right, and how powerful we ought to make the sovereign. Okay, Hobbes, right, has this view that the sovereign ought to be all powerful, if you will. So let's say the difference, how to generally capture it, is how powerful should the sovereign be, or the government, right? For Hobbes, better be all powerful. Otherwise, this whole process was pointless, right? The social contract. Remember the quote. I forgot how it goes exactly, but agreements without swords are basically worthless, right? Without the threat of actually doing something, if you don't abide by what you said you're going to do, if there's no threat, people are just going to make all these agreements and not do any of it, right? So you need to have a very powerful sovereign in place that strikes fear in the people so that they actually comply with the contract that they agreed to in the first place. Okay, otherwise, it's all moot. This was all pointless. Okay? You have to have an all-powerful sovereign in place, or none of it's going to work, according to Hobbes. And that makes sense. Again, especially if you're on board with his very dreary picture of human nature, where we can't trust each other and so on, and we're going to all try to weasel out of things if we can, right? But if you're like Locke and you're not that kind of a pessimist, then why would you find the need for this all-powerful sovereign? And so Locke doesn't emphasize that, and instead he emphasizes, right, limiting the government, being on guard against the government, putting in all kinds of checks and balances to make sure it's doing the right thing at all times. Okay? So he emphasizes, Locke, that is, the reason for entering into a social contract in the first place, to further our own interests. Okay? And if at any time we feel that our own interests aren't being furthered via the social contract, then not only is it our right, but he seems to speak almost as if we have a duty or an obligation then to revolt and get out, right, and reject the contract at that point. Okay, so pretty interesting stuff here. Hope you enjoyed our discussion of Hobbes and Locke, especially not especially, but including the at times very dreary sort of outlook and picture of, like, for example, the state of nature, and are things really as dreary as Hobbes suggests? I'll be interested to find out what you guys think. So again, some of these reflection time questions get back to that basic question, right? Are things as bad as Hobbes makes it seem, or are you more of an optimist like Locke? And what about this notion? Remember, Locke, I like the first question here in the reflection time. Locke's pretty confident, right, that in the state of nature, if we go back and we find ourselves in the state of nature, that our reason is going to ensure some degree of respect towards one another. How confident are you in that, right? If you take 500 random people and you're one of them, throw you all on an island, how confident are you that just because you all have a rational capacity, that you guys will make things work to some extent, that people will be somewhat civil at least? Okay? Hobbes is going to say, no, it's going to work out just like Lord of the Flies, right? You might start off promising, but it doesn't matter if it's, young boys or middle-aged men or women. It doesn't matter who these people are. If they're human, Hobbes says, it's going to slowly devolve into war, just like it did in Lord of the Flies. So interesting stuff here. Again, a lot of this is basically going back to the fundamental tension, which I started off the Hobbes lecture by alluding to, between freedom and security. Then we have the state of nature here, or anarchy, if you will, right? There, now very few of us are anarchists. Maybe there's some of us, right? But most of us are going to say, hey, got to move this way. Well, again, how far? How far do we need to move? Now, Hobbes would seem to be, given his extreme lack of trust in anyone, that we need to give up a lot of this, right? We're going to need to move pretty far. Or Locke, maybe not so much. And what's interesting, right, this is a nice segue then to our next lecture, Lecture 5, where we'll introduce John Stuart Mill, a very interesting philosopher who's also going to be on board, right, with the notion that we need to move this way. But how do we go about that process? And so it's an interesting discussion, this idea of our personal liberties. How do we go about limiting personal freedoms, individual liberties, right? Granted, we need to make some concessions and do this to some extent, right? Mill's also interested in this sort of issue. Well, how do we go about doing this? To what extent is it permissible to restrict people's individual freedoms, and on what grounds? And so in the next lecture, we'll talk about John Stuart Mill and his famous views regarding paternalism, this idea that it's okay to restrict someone's what they're doing for their own benefit, right? I can't let you do that because it'll actually hurt you, right? Mill has some interesting views on that idea of paternalism. He offers his famous harm principle as a starting ground for how we ought to decide when it's permissible to step in and restrict someone's freedom. So he's trying to tackle this very issue, and so we'll have some more interesting discussions ahead of us. He also talks about, we'll have some discussions regarding censorship, right? A very much related issue, right? Because you're stepping in and you're infringing on somebody's individual freedoms when you don't allow them to view certain stuff, for example. When is that permitted? Should it be permitted at all? So that's what we have to look forward to. Hopefully you enjoyed our discussions again of both Hobbes and Locke. And stay tuned, and we'll see you for Lecture 5. Thanks.